The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Amira Jackson checked her luggage one last time. Today wasn't just another day. It was the culmination of months of preparation for the biggest case of her career. As a respected attorney from Atlanta, Amira had built a reputation for handling complex international business disputes, and the conference in London represented a chance to establish her firm on the global stage. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, smoothing down her carefully chosen outfit, a cream-colored designer suit that had cost more than she'd ever spent on clothing before. But this was an investment in her future, in how the world would see her when she stepped up to that podium. In her briefcase sat the presentation she'd been perfecting for weeks, each page containing arguments that could change the direction of international business law. The ride to the airport was quiet. Her driver, sensing her concentration, didn't attempt small talk. Amira used the time to mentally review key points from her presentation, occasionally jotting notes in her leather-bound planner. By the time they reached the airport, she felt as ready as she could be. The first-class check-in went smoothly. Amira had flown enough to know the routine, the polite smiles, the efficient handling of her passport, the directions to the exclusive lounge where she could wait in comfort. As a black woman who had worked her way up from humble beginnings, she never took these privileges for granted. Each one represented years of late nights, of being the first one in the office and the last to leave, of proving herself over and over again. In the lounge, Amira responded to several urgent emails and made a quick call to her husband, Terrell. Unlike many of her colleagues, she'd found a partner who truly supported her career, who understood the importance of these moments. "Just wanted to hear your voice before I board," she said, smiling at the familiar sound of his laugh. "You're going to be amazing," Terrell replied. "London won't know what hit them." Terrell didn't mention his own busy day ahead. As the founder of a technology investment firm that had recently acquired a significant stake in several major companies, including the airline Amira was about to fly with, he had his own meetings to attend. Their relationship worked because they respected each other's achievements without competition, supporting each other through every step. When boarding began, Amira gathered her things and headed to the gate. The flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles, directing them to their seats with efficient gestures. Amira settled into her first-class seat, arranging her belongings carefully. The presentation materials went into the seat pocket in front of her, within easy reach for last-minute review during the flight. As other passengers boarded, Amira observed them with the natural curiosity of someone who made her living understanding people. An elderly couple carefully helping each other stow their carry-ons, a businessman already tapping away at his laptop, a young mother traveling alone with a sleeping infant, the first-class cabin filled with people from different walks of life, all sharing this brief journey together. Once everyone was seated and the pre-flight announcements had finished, a flight attendant named Brenda began taking drink orders from first-class passengers. Amira watched as Brenda moved methodically from seat to seat, offering warm smiles and friendly conversation to each person. When Brenda reached the businessman sitting across the aisle from Amira, she lingered, laughing at his jokes and making recommendations about which wine would pair best with the in-flight meal. Amira waited patiently, using the time to organize her notes. After several minutes, Brenda moved on to the elderly couple, showing the same attentive service. Finally, she approached Amira's seat. The warmth that had characterized her interactions with other passengers seemed to dim slightly. "Something to drink?" she asked, her voice noticeably cooler. "Apple juice, please," Amira replied with a polite smile, trying to ignore the change in demeanor. "And perhaps a glass of water as well?" "We'll get to that after takeoff," Brenda responded, already turning away. Amira returned to her notes, pushing aside the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in her chest. She'd experienced similar treatment before. Subtle differences in how people spoke to her, looked at her, served her. Over the years, she'd learned when to speak up and when to let things go. This, she decided, wasn't worth disrupting her preparation. The plane took off smoothly, climbing through clouds into clear blue skies. As the seatbelt sign turned off, the flight attendants began their service. Brenda returned to the first-class cabin, once again starting with the passengers across from Amira. One by one, everyone received their requested drinks along with warm nuts and hot towels. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Amira watched as passengers around her sipped their beverages, some already on their second round. Her own tray table remained empty. She considered pressing the call button but hesitated. Years of experience had taught her that assertiveness from black women was often misinterpreted as aggression. When Brenda passed by again, Amira gently raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I believe I ordered apple juice earlier. Would it be possible to get that now?" Brenda's smile tightened. "We're quite busy, ma'am. I'll get to you when I can." Another 15 minutes passed. The businessman across the aisle received a fresh drink without even asking. The elderly couple was offered a selection of magazines. A flight attendant Amira hadn't seen before brought warm cookies to several passengers. The injustice of the situation began to weigh on Amira. This wasn't about apple juice anymore. It was about being seen, about being treated with the same respect afforded to everyone else. After nearly an hour of waiting, she decided to try once more. As Brenda passed through the cabin, Amira pressed her call button. The soft ding seemed to echo through the cabin. Brenda approached, her expression making it clear that the interruption was unwelcome. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you," Amira said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "But I ordered apple juice quite some time ago, and I notice everyone else has been served. Would it be possible to get my drink now?" Something shifted in Brenda's expression, a hardening, a decision being made. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Right away. When Brenda returned minutes later, she carried a glass of apple juice. As she extended her arm to place it on Amira's tray table, her hand tilted. The golden liquid arced through the air, splashing across Amira's cream suit, soaking into the fabric and spattering the presentation materials she'd placed on the tray. A collective gasp rose from nearby passengers who had witnessed the incident. Amira froze, momentarily unable to process what had happened. The cold liquid seeped through to her skin as documents she'd spent weeks preparing darkened with moisture. "Oh," Brenda said flatly. "I'm so sorry. It was an accident." Her expression betrayed the lie. This had been deliberate, calculated, a power play designed to put Amira in her place. Amira looked up at Brenda, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. Both women knew exactly what had happened. Both knew why. "I'll get you some napkins," Brenda said before walking away, leaving Amira sitting in soaked clothing with ruined papers spread before her. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, his expression troubled. The elderly woman nearby reached into her purse, offering Amira a packet of tissues with a sympathetic smile. Small gestures of kindness that highlighted the cruelty of what had just occurred. As Amira dabbed ineffectually at the spreading stain, she felt a complex mix of emotions: humiliation, anger, resignation. This wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Each incident carried the weight of all those that had come before, a burden that grew heavier with time rather than lighter. With trembling hands, she gathered her damp presentation materials, assessing the damage. Some pages were still readable, others blurred beyond recognition. Hours of work would need to be redone, and her carefully chosen outfit was ruined before she'd even reached her destination. What Brenda didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was who Amira was married to. As Amira made her way to the bathroom to attempt to clean herself up, she pulled out her phone. With steady hands, she took photos of her stained clothing and damaged documents. Then she composed a text message to her husband explaining what had happened in clear, factual language. Terrell would understand the significance of this moment. He would recognize it for what it was. Not just poor customer service, but a deliberate act of disrespect targeted at his wife because of her race. And unlike many who faced similar treatment, Amira and Terrell were in a position to do something about it. As she pressed send on the message, Amira had no way of knowing the chain of events she had just set in motion. Events that would change not just the course of this flight, but potentially the culture of an entire airline. The airplane bathroom was cramped and poorly lit, making Amira's task even more difficult. She stood at the tiny sink, dabbing at her once pristine suit with damp paper towels, watching as the beige fabric darkened with moisture, but refused to release the apple juice stain. The sweet, sticky residue clung stubbornly to the expensive material, a visible reminder of what had just happened. As she worked, Amira caught sight of her reflection in the mirror, her carefully styled hair still perfect, her makeup flaw less the professional image she had cultivated over years of practice, but her eyes told a different story. There was hurt there, and anger, and a weariness that came from experiencing this same story too many times before. Not now, she whispered to herself, pushing down the emotions that threatened to surface. Focus on solutions. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Hello? A woman's voice called. I saw what happened. I have some clothes in my carry-on if you'd like something dry to change into. Amira opened the door to find an older white woman with kind eyes standing in the narrow corridor. She held out a folded blouse and a light cardigan. I'm Diane, the woman said. These might not be your style, but they're clean and dry. The unexpected kindness nearly broke Amira's composure. Thank you, she managed. That's very thoughtful. What happened back there wasn't right, Diane continued, her voice low but firm. Several of us saw it. It wasn't an accident. Amira nodded, unable to find the words to respond. This was the reality of discrimination, the incident itself, followed by the exhausting mental calculation of how to react, what to say, how to navigate the aftermath without being labeled as difficult or aggressive. I've written down my contact information, Diane added, handing Amira a slip of paper along with the clothes. If you decide to file a complaint with the airline, I'd be happy to share what I saw. Thank you, Amira said again, genuinely touched by the woman's solidarity. I appreciate that more than you know. After Diane left, Amira changed into the borrowed clothes. The blouse was a bit loose and the style more casual than she preferred, but it was clean and dry. She carefully folded her stained suit and placed it in a plastic bag from her purse. Then, taking a deep breath, she prepared to return to her seat. Walking back through the cabin, Amira felt the weight of eyes on her. Some passengers quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation of what they had witnessed. Others offered small smiles of support or sympathetic nods. The businessman who had received such attentive service earlier caught her eye and shook his head slightly, his expression troubled. As Amira approached her seat, she noticed that her damaged presentation materials had been collected and placed in a neat stack. Beside them sat a plastic cup of water, not the apple juice she had requested hours ago, and with no napkin, no ice, none of the small courtesies extended to other first-class passengers. The message was clear. This was all she could expect. Settling back into her seat, Amira pulled out her phone to check if Terrell had responded to her message. He had. This is unacceptable. Sending you love. Trust me to handle this. Can you tell me the flight number and the name of the flight attendant? Amira quickly typed back the details, including Brenda's name, which was visible on her name tag. She added that several other flight attendants had witnessed the incident, but done nothing to help. What Amira didn't know was what was happening on the ground as her message traveled thousands of miles below. She couldn't see her husband sitting in a boardroom, surrounded by executives from various companies within his investment portfolio. She couldn't see his expression change as he read her message, or the way he quietly excused himself from the meeting. Terrell Jackson had built his technology investment firm from nothing, working his way up through the corporate world with a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and unwavering determination. Unlike many who achieved his level of success, he had never forgotten the discrimination he had faced along the way, and he had made it his mission to use his influence to fight such injustice whenever possible. The airline whose plane Amira was currently sitting in had recently become part of his portfolio through a quiet acquisition. Few people knew that Terrell's firm now held a controlling interest in the parent company, a fact that was about to become very relevant. As Amira tried to salvage what she could of her presentation materials, Terrell was making a phone call to the airline's CEO, a call that would set in motion a chain of events none of the flight crew could have anticipated. Back on the plane, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed. The other passengers seemed subdued, conversation reduced to whispers. Brenda and the other flight attendants moved through the space with practiced efficiency, but they pointedly avoided Amira's section, neither offering service nor making eye contact. Amira found herself isolated in a cabin full of people. She pulled out her tablet, relieved to find that her digital backup of the presentation was intact, and began the process of recreating what had been lost. Work had always been her refuge, a place where merit mattered more than prejudice. She immersed herself in the familiar language of contracts and precedents, trying to ignore the discomfort of damp clothing and the lingering smell of apple juice. A passenger from a few rows, Back, a young man who had witnessed the entire incident approached her seat. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I'm a law student, and I just wanted to say that I admire how you're handling this. If there's anything I can do to help, thank you," Amira replied with a small smile. "Just your acknowledgement helps more than you know." This was another reality of such incidents, the strange mix of isolation and unexpected connection, the way they revealed character not just in those who perpetrated them, but in those who witnessed them. As the young man returned to his seat, Amira noticed Brenda watching them from the galley, her expression sour. There was something new in her demeanor now, a hint of uncertainty, perhaps even worry. It was the look of someone who had acted with impunity, but was beginning to wonder if there might be consequences after all. What Brenda couldn't know was that at that very moment, her actions were being discussed in the highest offices of the airline. Terrell had reached the CEO, Richard Thompson, on his private line. Their conversation had been brief but impactful. "Richard," Terrell had said, his voice perfectly controlled, "my wife is currently on Flight 237 to London, where one of your flight attendants deliberately poured apple juice on her after ignoring her requests for service for over an hour. I've received photos of the incident and statements from other passengers confirming that this appeared to be racially motivated." There was a pause before Richard responded, his voice careful. "Terrell, I'm deeply sorry to hear this. We take such allegations very seriously." "This isn't an allegation," Terrell interrupted. "This is a fact documented by multiple witnesses. And given our recent arrangement, I'm sure you understand that I have a particular interest in how your airline treats its customers, especially when one of those customers is my wife." The reference to our recent arrangement was not lost on Richard. The acquisition had been completed just weeks ago, and while it hadn't been widely publicized, Richard was well aware that Terrell's firm now held enough power to make significant changes to the airline's leadership if they chose to do so. "I'll handle this personally," Richard assured him. "Can you give me the flight details and the names of the staff involved?" As Terrell provided the information, Richard was already sending urgent messages to his operations team. Within minutes, a chain of communication had been established that would reach the cockpit of Flight 237. Meanwhile, Amira continued working on her presentation, unaware of the wheels that had been set in motion. The flight was about 2 hours into its journey across the Atlantic. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of long-haul travel, watching movies, reading books, or trying to get some sleep. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when the captain's voice broke through the cabin's quiet hum. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've just received information from our operations center that we'll need to make an unscheduled landing to address a staffing issue. We'll be diverting to our nearest appropriate airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing in approximately 30 minutes. A murmur of confusion spread through the plane. Unscheduled landings were rare and usually indicated an emergency. Passengers exchanged worried glances, checking seatbelts and stowing items that had been taken out during the flight. From her seat, Amira watched as the flight attendants huddled near the galley, their expressions tense. Brenda's face had drained of color, and she seemed to be arguing with a male flight attendant who kept shaking his head firmly. For the first time since the incident, one of the other flight attendants approached Amira's seat. He was young, probably new to the job, and his hands trembled slightly as he bent down. "Ms. Jackson?" he asked quietly. "The captain would like to speak with you once we've landed. He asked me to assure you that the situation is being addressed." Amira nodded, surprised not just by the message but by the use of her name, a name she hadn't given to any of the flight crew. This confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Terrell had made contact with the airline. As the plane began its descent, Amira felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that the discrimination she had faced wouldn't go unaddressed. But there was also discomfort. She had built her career on her own merits, fighting her own battles. Having Terrell step in, while justified, felt like a departure from her usual approach. The aircraft touched down smoothly at a regional airport Amira didn't recognize. As they taxied to the terminal, she could see several vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Not the usual ground sow. Upboard equipment, but what appeared to be company cars with the airline's logo. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced. "We've arrived at our temporary stop. We'll be on the ground for approximately 1 hour while we address our staffing situation. You're welcome to remain seated, but you may also stand up to stretch. Please do not attempt to deplane at this time." As the seatbelt sign turned off, Brenda and 3 other flight attendants were called to the front of the plane. They moved through the cabin with rigid postures, avoiding eye contact with passengers. At the aircraft door, they were met by 2 men in airline management uniforms. Words were exchanged in low voices, but the tension was palpable. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, the 4 flight attendants were escorted off the plane. They carried nothing with them, no personal items, no bags, suggesting this was not a planned crew change. The cabin buzzed with speculation. Passengers who had witnessed the incident with Amira began explaining what had happened to those who hadn't, the story spreading through the aircraft like wildfire. "Did you see that? They just took them off the plane." "Well, after what that one did to the lady in 3A, I'm not surprised. I've never seen anything like this before." Amira sat quietly, processing what was happening. She hadn't asked for this. Level of response hadn't demanded that anyone lose their job. She had simply documented what had occurred and shared it with her husband. The scale of the reaction suggested that Terrell's influence with the airline was even greater than she had realized. A new group of flight attendants boarded the plane, their expressions professional but curious. Among them was an older man in an executive uniform who scanned the cabin before making his way directly to Amira's seat. "Ms. Jackson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Carlos Rodriguez, Regional Director for Customer Experience. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. We've removed the staff involved and they will face appropriate consequences. I'd like to invite you to use our private lounge while we prepare to resume our journey, where you can refresh yourself and where we have arranged for dry cleaning for your suit." As Amira considered his offer, she realized that this moment represented more than just resolution for a single incident. It was an opportunity to address a deeper issue, to use this unexpected platform to push for meaningful change. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez," she said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the circumstances. "Before I accept your offer, I'd like to know what steps your airline plans to take to ensure that what happened to me today doesn't happen to anyone else tomorrow." Carlos's expression shifted, surprise giving way to genuine consideration. He hadn't expected this response, not anger or demands for compensation, but a focus on systemic change. "That's a fair question," he acknowledged, "and one I'd like to discuss with you in detail if you're willing." As Amira gathered her belongings to follow him off the plane, she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her. There was respect in those gazes now, and something else, a recognition that they were witnessing not just the aftermath of an ugly incident, but possibly the beginning of something important. What none of them could know was how far-reaching the consequences of that spilled apple juice would ultimately be, or how it would transform not just one airline's policies, but potentially industry standards. As she stepped off the plane into the bright afternoon sun, Amira straightened her borrowed blouse and walked with the same dignity and purpose that had carried her through every challenge in her remarkable career. Terrell Jackson was not a man who lost his composure easily. Years of navigating the high-pressure world of technology investments had taught him to keep his emotions controlled, his decisions calculated. This skill had served him well as he built his company from a small startup to a major player in the industry, acquiring businesses that others overlooked and transforming them into success stories. But when he saw the photos Amira had sent, his brilliant, accomplished wife sitting in a juice-soaked suit while trying to salvage her ruined presentation, something shifted inside him. The boardroom around him seemed to fade as he focused on the images, on the hurt and humiliation that must have accompanied them. The meeting he was attending was important. Representatives from 5 companies in his portfolio were presenting quarterly results, projections for the coming year. Under normal circumstances, nothing would have pulled him away, but these weren't normal circumstances. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through a financial officer's presentation. "I need to step out for a few minutes. Please continue without me." The executives exchanged surprised glances. Terrell was known for his focus, his unwavering attention. For him to leave in the middle of a presentation was unprecedented. In the hallway outside the conference room, Terrell dialed the number of Richard Thompson, the airline's CEO. They weren't close friends, but they had met several times since. Terrell's firm had acquired a controlling interest in the airline's parent company. Richard had always struck Terrell as competent and straightforward, if somewhat conventional in his thinking. As the phone rang, Terrell paced the empty hallway, his mind racing through possible approaches. He had learned early in his career that how you handled incidents like this set the tone for an entire organization. This wasn't just about getting justice for Amira, although that was certainly his priority, but about sending a message about what kind of behavior was acceptable within companies associated with his name. Terrell. Richard's voice came through the line, surprise evident in his tone. This is unexpected. What can I do for you? Terrell paused, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that those who knew him recognized as dangerous. Richard, he began, my wife is currently on Flight 237 to London, where one of your flight attendants deliberately poured apple juice on her after ignoring her request for service for over an hour. I've received photos of the incident and statements from other passengers confirming that this appeared to be racially motivated. There was a moment of stunned silence before Richard responded, his voice careful. Terrell, I'm deeply sorry to hear this. We take such allegations very seriously. This isn't an allegation, Terrell interrupted, his tone sharpening. This is a fact documented by multiple witnesses, and given our recent arrangement, I'm sure you understand that I have a particular interest in how your airline treats its customers, especially when one of those customers is my wife. The reference to our recent arrangement wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. While Terrell rarely wielded his financial influence as a weapon, he wouldn't hesitate when it came to addressing discrimination, particularly when it affected someone he loved. I'll handle this personally, Richard assured him, his tone shifting from defensive to proactive. Can you give me the flight details and the names of the staff involved? As Terrell provided the information, he could hear Richard typing rapidly, presumably sending urgent messages to his team. I want immediate action, Terrell continued. The flight attendants responsible should be removed from duty, and I want a full investigation into not just this incident, but into whether this represents a pattern of behavior. Of course, Richard agreed quickly. I'm contacting our operations center now. We'll arrange for the plane to make an unscheduled stop to replace the crew, and I'll have our head of HR prepare for a comprehensive review of our training and diversity policies. This rapid capitulation didn't surprise Terrell. Richard was a pragmatist who understood the business implications at stake. Beyond the moral imperative to address discrimination, there were potential legal and public relations consequences if the story became public, not to mention the impact on the airline's relationship with its newest and most influential investor. I appreciate your quick response, Terrell said, his voice measured. Please keep me informed of developments. And Richard, I'll be watching how this is handled very closely. After ending the call, Terrell remained in the hallway for a few moments, processing what had just happened. There was a certain irony to the situation. The flight attendant had likely seen Amira as just another passenger, someone she could disrespect without consequence. She had no way of knowing that the woman she had targeted was married to someone with the power to reshape the entire airline. But Terrell knew this wasn't how it should work. Justice shouldn't depend on who you knew or how much influence you wielded. The fact that he could get immediate action while countless others faced similar discrimination without recourse was a reminder of how broken the system was. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Action initiated. Flight diverting to regional airport will update soon. Taking a deep breath, Terrell prepared to return to his meeting. The financial presentations would continue, projections would be discussed, strategies debated. But something had shifted in his perspective. This incident had solidified a decision that had been forming in his mind for months, to use his growing influence to address systemic discrimination more directly, more intentionally. As he re-entered the boardroom, conversations paused. The executives nodded. His expression exchanged glances. Terrell Jackson was known for his calm demeanor, his measured responses. But those who worked closely with him recognized the look in his eyes now, the look that had preceded some of his most transformative business decisions. "Please continue," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I believe we were discussing projected growth for the next quarter." The presentation resumed, but Terrell's mind was partially elsewhere, already considering how this incident might become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one flight, one airline, or even one industry. Meanwhile, in the airline's headquarters, Richard Thompson had launched into action. His initial shock at Terrell's call had quickly given way to pragmatic crisis management. As CEO, he had handled numerous challenging situations over the years, but this one carried unique urgency due to the individuals involved. Richard called his operations team into an emergency meeting, explaining the situation in clear terms. "This isn't just a customer service issue," he emphasized to the room of executives. "This is a direct challenge to our stated values as a company. And yes, it also involves one of our most significant investors, which adds another dimension of urgency." The team moved quickly, establishing communication with the flight and arranging for it to land at the nearest suitable airport. Carlos Rodriguez, the regional director who happened to be in the area for other business, was dispatched to meet the plane and personally manage the situation. "We need to be transparent about what happened and decisive in our response," Richard instructed. "The flight attendants involved should be removed immediately pending investigation. I want a new crew ready to take over the flight with minimal delay for passengers." As these plans were being implemented, Richard also contacted the airline's legal and HR departments. "I want a full review of our training procedures," he told them. "And I want to understand if there have been other incidents involving these flight attendants that might have been overlooked." The machinery of corporate response was in full motion, gears turning with unusual speed. What might normally have taken days or weeks to address was being handled in minutes, a testament to both the seriousness of the incident and the influence of those involved. While this flurry of activity unfolded at the airline's headquarters, the aircraft carrying Amira continued its journey across the Atlantic, its passengers and crew unaware of the storm brewing below. For Brenda and her colleagues, it was just another flight. For Amira, it was an uncomfortable experience she was enduring with as much dignity as possible. Neither could anticipate how dramatically the situation was about to change. In the cockpit, Captain David Chen and his co-pilot were monitoring their progress when a priority message came through from operations. David read it with growing concern, then reread it to ensure he understood what was being asked. "They want us to divert," he told his co-pilot, disbelief evident in his voice. "Apparently there's been a serious incident involving the cabin crew." The co-pilot frowned. "Mechanical issue? Medical emergency?" "Neither," David replied, scanning the rest of the message. "It says there was a serious customer service incident with discriminatory implications and that we need to land as soon as possible to replace certain crew members." This was unprecedented in David's 20 years of flying. He had diverted for medical emergencies, for severe weather, for mechanical concerns, but never for a customer service issue, no matter how serious. The fact that the order came directly from the CEO's office made it clear that this was no ordinary situation. "Operations has sent coordinates for a regional airport about 30 minutes from our current position," he continued. "They've arranged for ground support and a replacement crew to be waiting." As the pilots adjusted their flight plan and notified air traffic control of their intention to divert, word began to spread among the cabin crew that something unusual was happening. The senior flight attendant, notified by the captain, gathered her team in the galley for a hushed conversation. "What's going on?" Brenda asked, her earlier confidence giving way to unease as she noted the serious expressions of her colleagues. "All I know is we're making an unscheduled landing," the senior attendant replied. The captain wouldn't give details, just said to prepare the cabin for arrival in 30 minutes. Brenda felt a flutter of anxiety. The incident with the passenger in 3A had been hours ago, and while she knew it hadn't been her finest moment, surely it wasn't serious enough to divert an international flight. Perhaps there was some other issue, something unrelated to her actions. But as she moved through the cabin, preparing for the unexpected landing, she caught sight of Amira still working on her tablet, borrowed clothes replacing her ruined suit. A creeping suspicion began to form in Brenda's mind, a dawning realization that perhaps she had misjudged the situation more severely than she had imagined. When the plane touched down at the regional airport, the truth became impossible to ignore. Waiting on the tarmac were several official vehicles bearing the airline's logo. As soon as the aircraft reached its temporary parking position, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our temporary stop. We'll be on the ground for approximately 1 hour while we address a staffing situation. You're welcome to remain seated, but you may also stand to stretch. Please do not attempt to deplane at this time." Within minutes, a message came for Brenda and 3 other flight attendants who had been working in her section. They were to report to the front of the aircraft immediately. As they made their way through the cabin, the eyes of passengers followed them, speculation already beginning to spread. At the aircraft door, they were met by 2 men in management uniforms whose expressions left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. One of them, older and clearly senior, addressed Brenda directly. "Ms. Peterson," he said, his voice low but firm, "you and your colleagues are being removed from duty effective immediately, pending an investigation into an incident involving a passenger in seat 3A. Please exit the aircraft now. Your personal belongings will be collected and forwarded to you." Brenda felt the blood drain from her face. This level of response was unprecedented, being removed mid-flight in front of passengers, without even the opportunity to collect her things. She began. "This is not a discussion," the manager interrupted. "Either exit the aircraft voluntarily, or we will have security escort you. Those are your options." Reality crashed down around Brenda like breaking glass. This wasn't a minor incident that would be documented and forgotten. This was something that had reached the highest levels of the company with remarkable speed. As she and her colleagues were escorted down the jetway, the magnitude of her miscalculation became painfully clear. What she couldn't know was that in a boardroom hundreds of miles away, Terrell Jackson was receiving updates about the situation. As he sat through financial projections and marketing strategies, his phone buzzed with messages from Richard Thompson. "Plane has landed. Crew members being removed. Regional director personally meeting with your wife. Full investigation underway. Will call when I have more details." Each message confirmed that his intervention had had its intended effect. The machine had been set in motion, and there would be consequences for what had happened to Amira. But even as he felt satisfaction in this knowledge, Terrell was already thinking beyond this single incident. The treatment Amira had experienced wasn't unique. What made it unusual was not the discrimination itself, but the response to it. The swift, decisive action taken because of who she was married to. For every Amira Jackson with connections to power, there were countless others who faced similar treatment without recourse, whose complaints were dismissed or buried in customer service systems designed to minimize rather than address problems. As the meeting around him continued, Terrell began making notes on his tablet, not about the presentations being given, but about a new initiative taking shape in his mind, an initiative that would use his growing influence to address discrimination more systematically, that would create accountability and change across the companies in his portfolio. By the time the meeting concluded, Terrell had outlined the framework for what would eventually become known as the Accountability Initiative, a program that would transform how companies under his influence approached diversity, equity, and treatment of both customers and employees. What had begun as a personal response to his wife's mistreatment was evolving into something much larger, something with the potential to impact thousands of lives. As executives filed out of the boardroom, one of Terrell's closest advisors lingered behind, noting the intensity of his expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seemed distracted during the presentations." Terrell looked up from his notes, his expression resolute. "No," he replied honestly. "Everything is not okay, but I'm working on changing that." The advisor raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone Terrell used when a significant decision had been made. "New acquisition?" he guessed. "No," Terrell said, gathering his materials. "Something more important? I'll brief the team tomorrow." As he left the boardroom, Terrell checked his phone one more time. A new message from Amira had arrived. "I'm safe. Airline management is being very responsive. Will call when I can. Love you." The simple message carried layers of meaning between husband and wife. Acknowledgement of his intervention, appreciation for his support, but also a gentle reminder that she was handling the situation with her characteristic competence and dignity. Terrell smiled slightly as he typed his response. "Love you too." Proud of you always." What had begun as an ordinary day, a business meeting for him, a flight to a conference for her, had transformed into something neither could have anticipated. The ripples from Brenda's action, from that deliberately spilled glass of apple juice, would continue to spread far beyond what anyone involved could imagine, touching not just one airline or one company, but potentially changing how an entire industry addressed issues of discrimination and accountability. As Terrell walked to his next meeting, his mind was already mapping out next steps, strategies for turning this moment of injustice into a catalyst for meaningful change. Because that was what he did best, seeing opportunities where others saw only problems, transforming setbacks into stepping stones toward a better future. The unexpected announcement about an unscheduled landing had sent a wave of whispers through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, exchanging theories about the mysterious staffing situation the captain had mentioned. For most, it was a curious interruption to an otherwise routine flight. For Amira, sitting quietly in her borrowed clothes, it represented something far more significant. As the aircraft touched down at the regional airport, Amira watched the activity outside her window with a mixture of emotions. She hadn't asked for this level of intervention, had simply documented what happened and shared it with her husband. The scale of the response suggested that Terrell had leveraged his influence more forcefully than she had anticipated. The procession of Brenda and 3 other flight attendants toward the front of the plane caught everyone's attention. Their rigid postures and averted gazes told a story of their own. When they were met at the door by airline management and escorted off without even collecting their personal belongings, a hushed silence fell over the cabin, followed by a surge of speculative conversation. "Did you see that? They just removed the entire crew. It must be because of what happened to that woman in first class. I've never seen anything like this before." Amira kept her expression neutral, despite the turmoil of her thoughts. As an attorney who had built her career fighting for justice within systems, she had complicated feelings about what was unfolding. On one hand, there was undeniable satisfaction in seeing swift consequences for discrimination. On the other hand, she was acutely aware that this response wasn't typical. It was happening because of who her husband was, not because the system itself worked properly. Her thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of a distinguished-looking man in an executive uniform. He scanned the cabin before his eyes settled on her, and he made his way directly to her seat. "Ms. Jackson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Carlos Rodriguez, Regional Director for Customer Experience. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. We've removed the staff involved, and they will face appropriate consequences. I'd like to invite you to use our private lounge while we prepare to resume our journey, where you can refresh yourself and where we have arranged for dry cleaning for your suit." Amira considered him carefully. His apology seemed genuine, his manner respectful. But she had encountered many well-intentioned executives whose commitment to addressing discrimination went only as far as managing specific incidents, never tackling the underlying issues. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez," she replied, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Before I accept your offer, I'd like to know what steps your airline plans to take to ensure that what happened to me today doesn't happen to anyone else tomorrow." The question clearly caught him by surprise. He had come prepared to offer compensation and comfort, the standard crisis management approach. What Amira was asking for was something different. Accountability not just for this incident but for preventing future ones. "That's a fair question," he acknowledged after a moment, "and one I'd like to discuss with you in detail if you're willing." Amira nodded and gathered her belongings, including her stained suit and damp presentation materials. As she followed Carlos through the cabin, she was aware of the eyes of other passengers tracking her movement. There was curiosity there and something else, respect perhaps, for how she was handling a situation that would have left many people shaken or angry. The terminal at the regional airport was small but modern. Carlos guided Amira to a private lounge typically reserved for VIP passengers. Inside, a small team was waiting, including a woman who introduced herself as the airline's head of customer advocacy, connecting remotely via video call. "Ms. Jackson," the woman began, "I'm Yasmin Lee. I want to extend our deepest apologies for what occurred on your flight today. We've already begun an internal investigation, and I'd like to hear directly from you about your experience, if you're comfortable sharing it." Amira recounted the events dispassionately, From the initial delayed service to the deliberately spilled juice to the subsequent lack of assistance, she was careful to stick to facts rather than assumptions about motives, though the racial component of the incident seemed evident to everyone involved. "Thank you for sharing that with us," Yasmin said when Amira had finished. "What happened to you represents a failure on multiple levels, not just the individual actions of the flight attendant, but also the culture that allowed those actions to occur without intervention from her colleagues." Carlos nodded in agreement. "We've already removed the flight attendants involved pending a full investigation. But to answer your earlier question about preventing similar incidents, we recognize that this requires more than disciplinary action against individuals. It requires systemic change." "What kind of systemic change?" Amira pressed. As an attorney who had worked on discrimination cases, she had heard many promises of reform that ultimately resulted in superficial changes rather than meaningful transformation. "That's actually something we hoped you might help us shape," Yasmin replied. "Your background in law gives you unique insight. We were planning to roll out enhanced diversity and inclusion training across our organization next quarter, but this incident has made it clear that we need to accelerate and deepen those efforts." Amira raised an eyebrow, surprised by the transparency and by the invitation to contribute. Most companies in crisis mode focused on damage control rather than genuine improvement. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "But I'm curious, why the urgency now? I can't imagine I'm the first person to experience discrimination on one of your flights." Carlos and Yasmin exchanged glances, and Amira could sense their discomfort with the question. "You're right," Yasmin admitted after a moment. "We've had complaints before, and while we've addressed them on a case-by-case basis, we haven't implemented the kind of comprehensive approach this issue deserves." She didn't mention Terrell or his connection to the airline, but she didn't need to. The subtext was clear. The response to this incident was different because of who was involved. Rather than expressing frustration at this reality, Amira saw an opportunity. If her connection to Terrell created leverage for broader change, then perhaps that leverage could be used to benefit others who lacked such influence. "I have some thoughts on what effective reform might look like," she said, setting her tablet on the table between them. "Would you be interested in hearing them?" For the next 45 minutes, as a new flight crew boarded the plane and prepared for departure, Amira outlined a comprehensive approach to addressing discrimination, one that went beyond the typical sensitivity training to include structural changes in how complaints were handled, how staff were evaluated, and how accountability was maintained. Carlos listened intently, occasionally making notes. "These are excellent suggestions," he said when she had finished. "Much more substantive than what we had planned. Would you be willing to share your contact information? I'd like to have our team follow up with you once you return from London." "Of course," Amira replied. "I'd be happy to continue this conversation." As they prepared to return to the aircraft, a staff member approached with Amira's suit, which had been rushed to a local cleaner for emergency treatment. The stain wasn't completely gone, but it was significantly less noticeable. "We've also taken the liberty of printing fresh copies of your presentation materials," Carlos added, handing her a leather portfolio with the airline's logo. "Our team accessed the digital files you shared with our customer service department and reproduced everything exactly as it was." This level of attention to detail was unusual, and once again Amira found herself with mixed feelings. The service was impressive, but she couldn't help wondering how many other passengers' complaints received such thorough attention. When they returned to the plane, Amira found the atmosphere had changed dramatically. A completely new flight crew greeted passengers with warm professionalism, and the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to apologize for our unscheduled stop and thank you for your patience. We'll be resuming our journey to London now, with an expected arrival time just 1 hour later than originally scheduled. My team and I are committed to making the remainder of your flight as comfortable and pleasant as possible." As Amira settled back into her seat, she noticed that someone had placed a handwritten note on her tray table. Opening it, she found a message from the new senior flight attendant. "Ms. Jackson, we want to personally assure you that the events that occurred earlier do not represent our airline's values or standards. Please let us know if there is anything at all we can do to make the remainder of your journey more comfortable." This gesture, while thoughtful, highlighted the stark contrast between how Amira was being treated now and how she had been treated before. A contrast that existed not because she was behaving differently or because she had demanded special attention, but because the airline now recognized who she was. The flight resumed without incident. The new crew was attentive and professional to all passengers, demonstrating what should have been the standard of service from the beginning. Amira used the remaining hours to finalize her presentation, her thoughts occasionally drifting to what was happening behind the scenes, the investigation that had been launched, the discussions at the corporate level, the calls and messages likely being exchanged between airline executives and Terrell's office. When the plane landed in London, Amira was surprised to find yet another airline representative waiting for her at the gate. This time a young woman who introduced herself as Charlotte, the airline's customer experience manager for European operations. "Ms. Jackson," Charlotte said warmly, "we've arranged a car to take you directly to your hotel, and we've upgraded your return flight to our premium first-class service. I've also been asked to give you this." She handed Amira an envelope containing a formal letter of apology, signed by the airline's CEO, along with a card with his direct contact information. "Thank you," Amira said, accepting the envelope. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not interested in special treatment for myself going forward. What I want is for the airline to commit to the changes we discussed, to ensure that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." Charlotte nodded. "That message has been conveyed very clearly from our headquarters. In fact, I've been told that your suggestions are already being incorporated into a new set of policies and procedures." As Amira rode in the airline's luxury car to her hotel, she finally had a moment to call Terrell. He answered on the first ring, his voice a mixture of concern and relief. "Amira, are you okay? I've been getting updates from the airline, but I wanted to hear from you directly." "I'm fine," she assured him, physically at least. "It was an ugly situation, but it's being addressed." "More than addressed," Terrell replied. "From what Richard Thompson tells me, they're using this as a catalyst for significant changes in how they handle discrimination issues. Apparently you gave them quite a detailed set of recommendations." Amira smiled slightly. "I may have shared some thoughts." There was a pause before Terrell spoke again. "I hope you don't mind that I intervened. I know you usually prefer to handle things yourself, but when I saw those photos—" "It's okay," Amira said softly. "In this case, I think your influence is being put to good use. But it does make me think about all the people who face the same treatment without having a billionaire spouse to call the CEO." "I've been thinking about that too," Terrell admitted. "This incident has made me realize that I need to be more proactive about using my position to address these issues systematically, not just when they affect us personally." This was one of the things Amira loved most about her husband, his ability to see beyond his own experience, to recognize his unique privilege and consider how it could be leveraged for broader change. "We should talk more about that when I get back," she said. "I have some ideas." "I look forward to hearing them," Terrell replied. "In the meantime, focus on your conference. I know how important this presentation is to you." After they said their goodbyes, Amira gazed out the car window at the London streets passing by. The incident on the plane felt simultaneously distant and immediate, a personal humiliation that had transformed into something larger, something with the potential to create meaningful change. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the consequences for Brenda and her colleagues were unfolding rapidly. Upon being removed from the flight, they had been taken to administrative offices at the regional airport for initial interviews with HR representatives who had been dispatched specifically for this purpose. Brenda sat in a sterile conference room, still wearing her flight attendant uniform, trying to process how quickly her situation had deteriorated. Hours earlier, she had been in a position of authority, making decisions about who received service and who didn't. Now, she found herself facing serious allegations that threatened not just this job but potentially her entire career. "Ms. Peterson," the HR representative began, her tone formal and cold, "we're investigating an incident involving a passenger in seat 3A on today's flight to London. Multiple witnesses have reported that you deliberately poured apple juice on this passenger after ignoring her requests for service for an extended period. How do you respond to these allegations?" Brenda had prepared a defense during the drive to the office, a story about turbulence, about an innocent accident, about misunderstanding. But faced with the HR representative's direct question and the knowledge that other passengers had witnessed what happened, Her carefully constructed explanation fell apart. "It was a mistake," she said weakly. "I didn't mean for the juice to spill." According to 3 separate witness statements, you tilted the glass deliberately as you placed it on the passenger's tray. The representative countered, reading from a tablet. One witness described your expression as satisfied immediately after the incident. As the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't going to be handled like previous customer complaints, with a cursory investigation and perhaps a warning. This was being treated as a serious violation of company policy, with the potential for termination. What Brenda couldn't know was that in addition to the immediate investigation, the airline had launched a broader review of her service history, examining past customer complaints and feedback from colleagues. This review was uncovering a pattern of behavior that had previously gone unaddressed. Incidents where passengers who were people of color had reported poor service or disrespectful treatment. Similar investigations were underway for the other flight attendants, who had been removed, not because they had directly participated in the incident with Amira, but because they had witnessed it and failed to intervene or report it. By the end of the day, all 4 had been placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending the completion of the investigation. For Brenda, who had worked for the airline for 15 years, the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. What she had perceived as a minor incident, one of countless small ways she exercised power in her domain, had escalated into a career-defining crisis. As she left the administrative offices, still in shock from the day's events, she checked her phone and found dozens of messages from colleagues who had heard about what happened. The incident was already becoming a cautionary tale within the company, a stark reminder that actions which might once have been overlooked or excused were now subject to serious consequences. What none of the flight attendants realized yet was that their case was being discussed. At the highest levels of the company, Richard Thompson had convened an emergency meeting of his executive team, where they were reviewing not just this specific incident, but the broader implications for the airline's culture and policies. "This situation has exposed significant gaps in our approach to discrimination," Richard told the assembled executives. "We need to address them not just because of who was involved in this particular case, but because it's the right thing to do and because it represents a serious business risk." The team spent hours discussing concrete steps from immediate changes to training and reporting, procedures to longer-term initiatives designed to transform the company culture. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined what would eventually become known as the Reynolds Standard, a comprehensive framework for ensuring equal treatment of all passengers regardless of race, gender, or background. As these discussions were taking place, the plane carrying Amira was soaring over the Atlantic. The new crew, aware of the circumstances that had led to their unexpected assignment, went out of their way to provide exemplary service to everyone on board. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from tension to something approaching normalcy, though conversations among passengers still occasionally returned to the dramatic events they had witnessed. For many, it would remain simply an unusual story to share with friends, and family, the day their flight made an unscheduled landing and half the crew was removed. For others, particularly those who had recognized the racial dimension of the incident, it represented something more profound, a rare moment when discrimination was met with immediate and decisive consequences. But for Amira and Terrell, this was just the beginning of a larger conversation about privilege and responsibility, about systems that responded to power but ignored the powerless, and about how to use their unique position to create change that would benefit those who lacked such advantages. As Amira prepared for bed in her London hotel room, she reflected on the day's events with a complex mixture of emotions. The humiliation of the incident itself still stung, but it was increasingly overshadowed by a sense of purpose, a determination to ensure that what had happened to her became a catalyst for meaningful change rather than just another story of privilege protecting privilege. What she couldn't know was how far-reaching the consequences of that spilled apple juice would ultimately be, not just for Brenda and her colleagues, not just for the airline, but potentially for an entire industry that had too often allowed discrimination to go unchallenged and unaddressed. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 237. Amira had completed her conference in London, delivering her presentation with characteristic brilliance despite the turbulent start to her journey, and had returned to Atlanta to resume her normal routine. But the ripple effects of what had happened continued to spread, touching lives and institutions far beyond that single flight. On a bright Tuesday morning, Amira sat in her home office reviewing case files when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. With the airline's corporate prefix, "Amira Jackson speaking," she answered, her tone professional. "Ms. Jackson, this is Richard Thompson, CEO of the airline. I hope I'm not interrupting your day." Amira straightened in her chair, surprised to be receiving a direct call from the CEO himself. "Not at all, Mr. Thompson. How can I help you?" "I'm calling to personally update you on the actions we've taken following the incident you experienced on your flight to London," Richard explained. "I believe my team has been in touch with you, but I wanted to speak with you directly about some significant changes we're implementing." Over the next 20 minutes, Richard outlined a comprehensive set of reforms that went far beyond what Amira had expected. The airline had conducted a thorough investigation, reviewing not just the specific incident but examining patterns across customer complaints and employee records. "The flight attendant who poured juice on you, along with 2 others who witnessed the incident and failed to intervene, have been terminated," Richard said. "Our investigation revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that should have been addressed long ago." Amira listened carefully, appreciating the thoroughness of the response, but remaining skeptical about whether these actions represented genuine change or simply crisis management. "We've also begun implementing what we're calling the Reynolds Standard," Richard continued. "It's a comprehensive framework for ensuring equal treatment of all passengers, with clear accountability measures and reporting mechanisms. Many of the elements came directly from the recommendations you shared with our team in London." This caught Amira's attention. She had indeed provided detailed suggestions during her conversation with Carlos and Yasmin, but she hadn't expected them to be implemented so quickly or to be named after her. "That's unexpected," she said carefully. "While I appreciate the recognition, I'm not sure about having my name attached to the program." "Actually," Richard clarified, "it's not just about recognizing your contribution. We believe having a name standard creates greater accountability, both internally and externally. When our staff and our passengers know there's a specific benchmark for how service should be delivered equally to all, it changes behavior and expectations." Amira considered this perspective. There was merit to the idea of a named standard, though she remained conscious of the irony that it had taken an incident involving someone connected to wealth and power to create changes that would benefit all passengers. "I understand your thinking," she acknowledged. "What matters most is that these changes are substantive and sustainable." "That's precisely why I'm calling," Richard continued. "Beyond the immediate actions we've taken, we're establishing a permanent customer equity advisory board to monitor implementation and recommend ongoing improvements. We'd be honored if you would consider joining this board, not as a corporate figurehead, but as someone who can help hold us accountable for living up to these commitments." The invitation was unexpected and intriguing. Throughout her career, Amira had worked to create change from within systems, recognizing that outsider criticism, while valuable, often lacked the leverage to implement practical reforms. This role would give her a platform to ensure that the airline's response wasn't just for show. "I'd like to learn more about what this would involve," she replied, her attorney's caution evident in her tone, including the level of independence this board would have and what real authority it would carry. "Of course," Richard agreed. "I'll have my team send over the draft charter we've developed. We're envisioning significant autonomy and direct reporting access to the board of directors, not filtered through management." After discussing a few more details and agreeing to review the materials, Amira ended the call with cautious optimism. She immediately dialed Terrell, who was in San Francisco for meetings with tech executives. "You'll never guess who just called me," she began when he answered. "Richard Thompson," Terrell guessed, surprising her. "How did you know?" "He mentioned he planned to reach out to you personally," Terrell explained. "We've been in regular contact about the changes they're implementing. I think they're taking this very seriously." "So it seems," Amira agreed. "They're calling it the Reynolds Standard, apparently." Terrell chuckled. "I heard. That wasn't my doing, for what it's worth. I think they recognize the symbolic value of having a clear named benchmark." They've also invited me to join some kind of advisory board to monitor implementation, Amira continued. I'm considering it, though I want to make sure it has real teeth. From what Richard has told me, they're giving it significant authority, Terrell replied. But more importantly, I think your presence would ensure they follow through on their commitments. Your expertise in discrimination law makes you uniquely qualified. Amira sighed, still processing the rapid evolution of events. It's just strange, isn't it, that it took something happening to someone connected to you to create this level of response? How many other passengers have faced similar treatment without anything changing? Too many, Terrell acknowledged soberly, which is actually something I wanted to talk to you about. This incident has made me realize I need to be more proactive about using my position to address these issues systematically. What are you thinking? Amira asked, recognizing the tone Terrell used when a significant idea was taking shape in his mind. I'm calling it the Accountability Initiative, he explained. The concept is to implement similar standards across all the companies in our portfolio, not just in response to incidents, but proactively. Creating systems to prevent discrimination and ensure that when it does occur, it's addressed swiftly, regardless of who the victim is. This was typical of Terrell, seeing beyond the immediate situation to identify patterns and opportunities for broader change. It was one of the qualities that had made him so successful in business, and that had drawn Amira to him from their first meeting. That sounds promising, she said. I'd like to help shape it if you're open to that. I was hoping you'd say that, Terrell replied warmly. Your perspective would be invaluable. As they continued discussing the details of the initiative, Amira felt a familiar sense of purpose emerging from what had been a deeply unpleasant experience. Throughout her career, she had focused on using her legal expertise to create more just systems. Now, combined with Terrell's business influence, they had an opportunity to drive change at a scale neither could achieve individually. While Amira and Terrell were developing their plans for broader reform, the consequences of the incident continued to unfold for those directly involved. Brenda Peterson, the flight attendant who had poured the juice, was facing the harsh reality of unemployment and a permanently damaged professional reputation. Sitting in her apartment, surrounded by job search websites open on her laptop, Brenda was confronting the full impact of her actions. She had never imagined that a moment of spite, one of countless small aggressions she had engaged in over the years, would cost her a 15-year career. The airline industry was tight-knit, and word of her termination for discrimination had spread quickly, making her virtually unhireable. What Brenda couldn't have anticipated was that her case would become a warning story in training sessions throughout the airline industry, an example of how quickly and severely the consequences of discrimination could manifest in the changing corporate landscape. Her name wasn't used, but the details of the incident were shared as a cautionary tale for flight crews across multiple airlines. For the other flight attendants who had been terminated, those who had witnessed Brenda's actions but failed to intervene, the consequences were similarly life-changing. They found themselves facing difficult questions during job interviews. Why did you leave your previous position? How would you handle witnessing a colleague engaging in discriminatory behavior? These conversations forced uncomfortable reflection about their role in enabling a culture where such incidents could occur. For some, it became a painful but necessary awakening to their own complicity in systems of discrimination, a realization that silence and inaction were forms of participation. Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters, the implementation of the Reynolds Standard was transforming operations at every level. New training programs were being developed, reporting systems overhauled, and accountability measures established. What had begun as a response to a single incident was evolving into a comprehensive reimagining of how the company approached diversity, equity, and customer service. Carlos Rodriguez, who had been the first executive to meet with Amira after the incident, found himself unexpectedly promoted to a newly created position, Chief Customer Equity Officer. His handling of the situation had demonstrated both empathy and a commitment to substantive change, qualities that the airline's leadership now recognized as essential for the challenges ahead. In his new role, Carlos was leading the development of the Customer Equity Advisory Board that Amira had been invited to join. The board was designed to include diverse voices from both inside and outside the company: civil rights attorneys, customer experience experts, and community leaders who could provide perspective and accountability. We're not just creating this for public relations purposes, Carlos explained during a planning meeting with his team. This needs to have real impact on how we operate. The recommendations this board makes should have clear pathways to implementation, with transparent metrics for measuring success. As the weeks passed, word of the airline's transformation began to spread throughout the industry. Other carriers, recognizing both the ethical imperative and the business case for addressing discrimination proactively, began developing their own versions of the Reynolds Standard. Trade publications ran articles about the shift. Customer advocacy groups cautiously praised the changes while emphasizing the need for ongoing vigilance. 3 months after the incident, Amira found herself boarding another flight on the same airline for a business trip to Chicago. The experience could not have been more different from her journey to London. The flight crew was attentive and professional with all passengers, regardless of race or gender. Small details that might once have been overlooked, ensuring that everyone received equal service, that requests were handled promptly, that respectful language was used consistently, were now visibly prioritized. As Amira settled into her seat, she noticed a discreet placard in the seatback pocket that hadn't been there before. It outlined the airline's commitment to equal treatment for all passengers and provided a QR code that linked to a reporting system for any concerns. The placard included the phrase, "Reynolds Standard Certified," accompanied by a simple logo that symbolized equality and accountability. The sight brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing tangible evidence of change, pride in having contributed to reforms that would benefit countless passengers beyond herself. But there was also a lingering awareness of the privilege that had made this response possible, the reality that her connection to Terrell had created leverage that most passengers experiencing discrimination simply didn't have. This awareness had fueled her decision to accept the position on the Customer Equity Advisory Board, where she could use her voice to advocate for those who might otherwise go unheard. In the 2 meetings the board had held so far, she had been impressed by the airline's willingness to listen to criticism and adapt its approaches. It wasn't perfect, institutional change never was, but it represented genuine progress. As the plane took off, Amira's thoughts turned to the broader accountability initiative that she and Terrell were developing. They had spent evenings and weekends refining the concept, creating a framework that could be implemented across diverse industries, from technology to retail to manufacturing. The initiative would require companies in Terrell's portfolio to adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination policies, with regular audits and clear consequences for non-compliance. But they had also recognized the limitations of their approach. Meaningful change couldn't depend solely on the influence of powerful individuals or corporations. It required systemic reforms that would protect everyone, regardless of whether they had connections to wealth or influence. This realization had led Amira to expand her legal practice to include more pro bono work representing individuals who had experienced discrimination but lacked the resources to seek justice. It had prompted Terrell to establish a foundation that would fund advocacy organizations fighting for structural changes in how discrimination was addressed across institutions. 6 months after the incident, Amira found herself standing at a podium in a hotel ballroom, addressing a conference on corporate social responsibility. In the audience were executives from major companies across multiple industries, along with activists, journalists, and policy experts. The Reynolds Standard began with a glass of apple juice, she told the assembled crowd, her voice steady and clear. A moment of discrimination that, because of who I'm married to, received an extraordinary response. But the real question we should be asking is not why this incident was addressed so thoroughly, but why countless others are ignored or minimized every day. She paused, looking out at the attentive faces. True equity doesn't mean special treatment for those with connections or resources. It means creating systems where everyone is treated with dignity and respect as a matter of course, and where accountability exists regardless of who is watching. Over the next 30 minutes, Amira outlined the key components of the accountability initiative, explaining how companies could implement similar standards in their own operations. She shared data showing that addressing discrimination wasn't just ethically right, but made strong business sense, improving employee retention, enhancing customer loyalty, and reducing legal risks. What happened to me on that flight represents both a failure and an opportunity, she concluded. A failure of culture that allowed discrimination to occur, but an opportunity to create lasting change that extends far beyond one incident or one company. The question for everyone in this room is, will you wait until a crisis forces your hand, or will you proactively build systems that make such incidents less likely to occur in the first place? The response was immediate and enthusiastic, a standing ovation that reflected both respect for Amira's personal story and recognition of the broader truth she had articulated. As executives approached her afterward, many expressed interest in learning more about implementing similar standards in their own organizations. Among those waiting to speak with her was a woman Amira didn't recognize. Middle-aged, professionally dressed with a thoughtful expression. "Ms. Jackson," the woman said when it was her turn, "I'm Gabrielle Wilson, Director of Flight Operations for Pacific Airways. Your speech was powerful, but what really resonated with me was how you've turned a personal incident into a catalyst for systemic change." "Thank you," Amira replied. "That's been my goal throughout this process." "I wonder if you might consider consulting with our airline as well," Gabrielle continued. "We haven't had a high-profile incident like yours, but that doesn't mean these issues don't exist in our organization. I'd rather address them proactively than wait for our own crisis." This request represented exactly what Amira and Terrell had hoped for, companies seeking to implement changes not in response to public relations disasters, but out of a genuine desire to create more equitable environments. Over the following months, similar conversations would lead to the accountability initiative being adopted by companies across multiple industries, creating a network of organizations committed to measurable, transparent standards for addressing discrimination. 1 year after the incident on Flight 237, Amira and Terrell hosted a gathering at their home to mark the anniversary, not of the discrimination itself, but of the changes it had catalyzed. The guest list included Carlos Rodriguez, now firmly established in his role as Chief Customer Equity Officer, Diane, the passenger who had offered Amira her clothes and support during the flight, and several members of the Customer Equity Advisory Board, who had become colleagues and friends. As they enjoyed dinner on the terrace overlooking the Atlanta skyline, the conversation naturally turned to reflection on what had been accomplished and what challenges remained. "The data from our first annual audit is encouraging," Carlos reported. "Customer complaints related to discriminatory treatment are down by 68%, and when incidents do occur, they're resolved more quickly and thoroughly." "What about the internal culture?" Amira asked. "Are employees reporting similar improvements?" "That's been more complex," Carlos acknowledged. "Change it then. To level takes longer, but we're seeing positive trends in our anonymous staff surveys, and the new reporting systems are being used consistently. People feel safer speaking up when they witness problematic behavior." Diane, who had maintained contact with Amira since that fateful flight, shared her own observations as a frequent flyer. "I've noticed a difference not just with your airline but with others that have adopted similar standards. There's more consistency in how passengers are treated, regardless of who they are. It's subtle, but it's real." As the evening progressed, Terrell raised his glass for a toast. "To turning moments of injustice into catalysts for change," he said, his eyes meeting Amira's across the table, "and to continuing the work that remains to be done." The gathering represented a moment of celebration, but everyone present understood that the work was far from complete. The Reynolds Standard and the broader accountability initiative had created meaningful improvements, but discrimination remained a persistent reality in many contexts. True change required ongoing vigilance, continuous improvement, and a commitment to addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. For Brenda Peterson, the flight attendant whose actions had set these events in motion, the year had brought painful but necessary growth. After months of unemployment and reflection, she had found work at a small regional hotel, a significant step down from her previous career, but an opportunity to start over. The experience of losing everything had forced her to confront the biases that had influenced her behavior and the real harm those biases had caused. In an unexpected development, Brenda had eventually written a letter to Amira, not asking for forgiveness or seeking to justify her actions. but acknowledging the wrong she had done and describing the process of reflection it had prompted. "I don't expect a response," she had written. "But I wanted you to know that what happened that day has changed how I see myself and others. I'm working to become someone who contributes to making spaces more equitable rather than less." Amira had read the letter several times, recognizing the courage it must have taken to write it. After careful consideration, she had sent a brief but thoughtful response, neither absolving Brenda nor condemning her, but acknowledging her efforts to change and grow. This exchange represented another dimension of resolution, not the neat, perfect closure of fiction, but the messy, complicated reality of human beings trying to do better, to learn from mistakes, to create meaning from difficult experiences. As for the airline industry as a whole, the ripple effects of that spilled apple juice continued to spread. The Reynolds Standard had become a benchmark against which other companies measured their own policies and practices. Industry publications regularly featured updates on its implementation and impact. Advocacy organizations cited it as an example of how corporate accountability could drive meaningful change. What had begun as a moment of discrimination, one of countless such moments that occurred every day across various contexts, had evolved into something neither Amira nor Terrell could have anticipated that day. A movement toward greater equity that extended far beyond one flight, one airline, or even one industry. On the second anniversary of the incident, Amira found herself speaking at a national conference on diversity and inclusion in corporate America. As she looked out at the audience of executives, activists, and policymakers, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this podium. 2 years ago, "I boarded a flight as just another passenger," she began. What happened that day was not unique. People face discrimination in large and small ways every day. What was unique was the response because of connections I had that most people don't. She paused, making eye contact with audience members. "The real achievement of the past 2 years isn't that I received justice for what happened to me. It's that we've begun creating systems where someone without my advantages might receive the same response, where accountability doesn't depend on who you know or how much influence you have, but is built into the fabric of how organizations operate." This, ultimately, was the true resolution of the story that had begun with that flight. Not just consequences for individual actions or changes within one company, but the gradual challenging work of building more equitable systems that would protect everyone, regardless of their connections or resources. As Amira concluded her speech, she shared a final thought that captured the essence of what she and Terrell had come to believe through this experience. Justice shouldn't be exceptional. It should be expected. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for Amira's words, but for the vision they represented. A world where incidents like the one she had experienced became increasingly rare, and where the response to such incidents was swift and meaningful for everyone, not just those with the power to demand it. As the applause washed over her, Amira felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what had been accomplished, humility about how much remained to be done, and a renewed commitment to the work ahead. The story that had begun with that glass of apple juice didn't have a neat ending. Instead, it continued to unfold in the ongoing efforts of countless individuals working toward a more just and equitable world. And perhaps that was the most honest resolution of all, not a conclusion, but a continuation. Not an ending, but a transformation. Not just a response to one moment of injustice, but a commitment to creating systems where such injustices became less common and where, when they did occur, the response was shaped by principles rather than privilege. For Amira and Terrell, for the airline and its employees, for the industry and beyond, the journey continued, challenging, imperfect, but moving steadily toward a vision of a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, not as a special accommodation but as a fundamental right.